You need to leave. This hotel isn't for people like you. The sentence didn't echo. It sliced, clean and deliberate, through the polished quiet of the lobby. Conversations died mid-sentence. Suitcases stopped rolling. Even the soft piano music seemed to hesitate. Aisha Carter stood still at the center of it all, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable, as if the words had landed somewhere far outside of her. She wore dark jeans, a fitted black t-shirt, and simple white sneakers. Nothing that matched the marble floors, the crystal lighting, the quiet luxury that wrapped around every corner of the building. And yet, something about her presence didn't fit the narrative being forced onto her. The manager, Gregory Vance, stood behind the front desk with his arms crossed, chin slightly raised, eyes scanning her like a problem already solved. "I'm not going to repeat myself," he added, louder this time, making sure the room heard him. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, curiosity rising. One woman near the lounge chair slowly lifted her phone. Aisha didn't respond immediately. She simply looked around the space, at the towering glass walls, the gold-trimmed counters, the staff standing stiff behind the desk, and for a brief moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger. Recognition. Like she had been here before. Like she knew exactly how this scene played out. Gregory misread the silence. He took a step forward, voice tightening with authority. "You don't have a reservation. You don't have clearance. And you're holding up paying guests." Aisha finally turned her gaze back to him. Calm, steady, almost surgical. "Are you sure about that?" she asked, her voice low but carrying further than his hat. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The question hung in the air, heavy, unsettling. Behind Gregory, one of the younger staff members glanced nervously at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, as if unsure whether to speak or stay invisible. The tension thickened, quiet but undeniable. Gregory let out a short laugh, dismissive. "I know exactly what I'm looking at," he said. "And this isn't it." That was when the first boundary shifted. A security guard stepped closer, not aggressive, but close enough to signal alignment. A guest whispered, "This doesn't feel right." Another voice answered, "Just watch." Aisha exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if releasing something old, something carried for years. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. No rush, no hesitation, just precision. She tapped once, bringing it to her ear. Gregory rolled his eyes. Calling someone isn't going to change, he stopped. Because something had changed. Not in the room. In her. The calm was still there, but now it had weight. Direction. "Yes," Aisha said quietly into the phone. "It's happening." A pause. A listening silence. Then her eyes lifted, locking onto Gregory with a clarity that made him shift, just slightly, for the first time. "Go ahead," she added. And just like that, without raising her voice, without taking a step forward, the balance in the room began to tilt. The line stayed open for half a second longer before the response came through, quiet but immediate, the kind of voice that moved things behind walls people never saw. And Aisha listened without nodding, without reacting, just absorbing as if this moment had already been accounted for long before she stepped through those glass doors, while across the desk Gregory shifted his weight, something small but noticeable, like confidence adjusting itself under pressure it did not understand, and behind him the young employee glanced again at the system screen, this time longer, eyes narrowing as if the information in front of him no longer matched the story being told out loud, while a guest near the far column stepped closer, phone now fully raised, not hiding it anymore, because the room had changed from a lobby into something else, something watchful, something waiting, and Gregory cleared his throat, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to leave now before we escalate this," he said, leaning slightly forward as if proximity could reassert control, but Aisha did not move. She ended the call with a soft tap and lowered the phone slowly, deliberately, her gaze drifting past him for a brief second, taking in the staff, the layout, the exits, every detail like she was measuring the room instead of reacting to it. And when her eyes returned to Gregory, there was a difference now, not louder, not sharper, just clearer, like a lens. Snapping into focus. "You already escalated it," she said, calm and even, and the words landed heavier than they sounded, because they were not a warning, they were a statement, and Gregory let out a short breath through his nose, turning slightly toward the security guard as if to confirm alignment. "We are following protocol," he replied, louder now, performing for the room. But the word protocol hung awkwardly, because it did not explain the tension tightening across faces or the way conversations had completely stopped. And from the side, a woman's voice cut in, soft but firm. "Did you even check her name?" And it was enough to create a ripple, small but spreading, because now it was no longer just one person being addressed. It was a situation being questioned, and the young employee behind the desk swallowed, fingers finally moving on the keyboard, hesitant at first, then faster, eyes scanning, pausing, scanning again, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but real. While Gregory did not notice, or chose not to, his attention locked on Aisha. "Last chance," he said, voice tightening again. "Walk out on your own." And for the first time, Aisha tilted her head. Slightly, not in confusion, but in assessment, like she was deciding how much further to let this unfold. And then she took one small step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to close the distance by inches, and in that space, the air changed again, because now it felt like the room was leaning toward her instead of away, and the young employee's voice broke through, quieter than it should have been but impossible to ignore. "Sir, her name is in the system." And everything paused. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, like a breath the entire room did not realize it was holding had just stopped halfway. The silence did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like something underneath the surface giving way, and Gregory turned his head just enough to look back at the screen, irritation already forming before he even saw it. "That is not possible," he said quickly, too quickly, as if speed could override reality. But the young employee did not move this time, his voice steadier now. "It is right here, sir, Aisha Carter. Penthouse level access, owner clearance." And the last two words did not land loudly, but they landed deep, because they did not belong in this version of the story Gregory had been telling, and for the first time his posture shifted, not much, just a fraction, but enough for the people watching to feel it, like a crack running through glass, while a guest near the front whispered, "Did he just say owner?" And another voice answered, "He did." And the energy in the room began to tilt again, this time faster, more visible, like something irreversible had started, and Gregory let out a short laugh, forced, sharp, "Systems glitch all the time," he said, waving it off with a flick of his hand. "That does not mean anything." But the words sounded thinner now, stretched over something they could not quite cover, and Aisha watched him, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing him to keep speaking, to keep building the weight of his own mistake. And that was the part he did not understand, that her silence was no longer passive. It was precise, it was deliberate, it was giving him space to expose exactly how far he was willing to go. And behind the desk the young employee swallowed again, glancing between the screen and Gregory, caught between instruction and truth. "There is also a note," he added carefully, "executive override, direct system authorization." And this time the room reacted, not loudly, but collectively, a shift in posture, a tightening of attention, because now it was no longer about a possibility, it was about a pattern, and Gregory's jaw tightened, his voice dropping lower, more controlled. "You are overstepping," he said to the employee, not looking at him fully, as if eye contact would validate the information. "Close that screen." But the command hung there, unanswered, because something else had taken hold in the room, something stronger than hierarchy, something closer to awareness, and from the side the same woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward another inch. "Why would the system say that if it was not true?" she asked, and no one answered, not because they could not, but because the answer was already forming in every mind present. And Aisha finally moved again, not toward the exit, not away, but slightly to the side, repositioning herself so she faced both Gregory and the growing circle of witnesses, her presence now centered, undeniable, and when she spoke, her voice was still calm, still measured, but there was something else in it now, something final. "You said you knew exactly what you were looking at," she said, her eyes holding his. "So tell me, what does this look like now?" And Gregory opened his mouth, then stopped, because for the first time since this began, the answer was not under his control, and the room knew it. And that was when the balance did not just tilt, it shifted. Gregory's silence did not last long, but it lasted long enough for the room to turn on him without saying a word. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, still firm, but now edged with something sharper, something defensive. Even if that name is in the system, that does not confirm identity, he said, straightening his jacket as if posture alone could restore authority. We have procedures for a reason. And the word procedures landed heavier this time, not as protection, but as a shield. And Aisha watched him carefully, not interrupting, because every word he chose now revealed more than he understood. And behind the desk the young employee hesitated again, then spoke quietly. There is also a photo on file. And Gregory's head snapped slightly in his direction, not fully turning, but enough to signal control slipping. Do not continue, he said under his breath. But it was too late, because the employee's eyes had already moved from the screen to Aisha and back. Again, and the recognition was subtle but undeniable, like a puzzle piece sliding into place, while a guest near the entrance whispered, "He is trying to talk his way out of it." And another replied, "It is not working." And the atmosphere shifted again, no longer uncertain, now leaning toward clarity, toward judgment, and Gregory took a step forward, closing the space again, trying to reassert dominance through proximity. "If you are who you claim to be, you can verify it right now," he said, his tone tightening into challenge. But Aisha did not reach for her wallet, did not pull out identification, did not offer proof on his terms. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm that now felt heavier than anything he could say. "You already had everything you needed," she replied, her voice even. "You just decided it was not enough?" And the words landed clean, cutting through the last layer of control he thought he had. And for a moment Gregory had no response. Because the truth of it was not loud, it was precise, and precision left no room to argue. And from the side the woman with the phone stepped closer, her voice steady now. "You asked her to leave before you checked anything," she said, not accusing, just stating. And that was what made it worse, because facts spoken plainly carried more weight than raised voices. And the security guard shifted his stance, no longer leaning forward, no longer aligned with Gregory in the same way, because uncertainty had reached him too. And behind the desk, the employee finally turned the screen slightly outward, not fully, but enough for the glow to reflect off the polished surface, enough for Gregory to see what he had been refusing to acknowledge. And the room watched him watch it, watched the exact moment realization tried to surface and get pushed back down by pride. And Aisha took one slow breath, steady and controlled, as if marking the end of one phase and the beginning of another. And when she spoke again, her tone did not rise. It sharpened. "You called security before you verified my name," she said, each word deliberate. "You decided who I was before you knew anything about me." And Gregory's jaw tightened. But this time he did not interrupt, because the room had already shifted too far, and everyone could feel it. The invisible line that had been crossed, the point where this was no longer about a guest being questioned, but about something much bigger being exposed. And Aisha's gaze held steady on him as she added, quieter now, but somehow stronger. "And that decision is the only thing you have proven today." The words did not echo, but they stayed, hanging in the air like something the room refused to let go of. And for a moment no one moved, not the guests, not the staff, not even Gregory, who stood there with his jaw set tight, eyes locked somewhere between the screen and Aisha, as if trying to choose which version of reality to believe. And then he exhaled slowly, forcing a smile that looked more like resistance than confidence. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be," he said, his tone shifting again, softer now but edged with control, like he was trying to pull the situation back into something manageable. "If there has been a misunderstanding, we can resolve it quietly." And the word quietly did not land the way he intended, because by now the room was anything but. Phones were fully raised. Whispers had turned into open observation, and the space no longer belonged to him in the way it had minutes ago. And Aisha noticed it all, every glance, every shift, every quiet alignment forming around her. And still she did not raise her voice. She did not step forward. She did not need to, because the weight of the moment was already moving in her direction. "A misunderstanding would mean you asked first," she replied, her tone calm, almost measured like she was laying out facts in a room that had finally learned how to listen. You did not ask, she continued. You decided. And Gregory's smile faded just slightly, enough for those watching to catch it. Enough to signal that control was no longer something he could perform into existence. And behind him the young employee straightened a little, as if the truth now had somewhere to stand. Sir, the profile shows executive authorization across all properties, he added. More clearly this time, no longer hiding behind hesitation, and that was when the room reacted again, more visibly now. A man near the entrance let out a low whistle. Another guest shook her head slowly, and someone near the lounge said, he tried to remove her, not as a question, but as a realization, and Gregory turned sharply toward the desk, frustration breaking through his controlled tone. That does not confirm identity, he repeated, but the repetition sounded weaker now, like an argument already losing its ground, and Aisha watched him carefully, not interrupting, because she understood something he did not, that the moment had already passed the point where words could fix it, that what mattered now was not what he said next, but what had already been seen, already been heard, and she let the silence stretch just long enough for that understanding to settle across the room. Then she spoke again, quieter this time, but sharper. You asked me to leave before you verified anything, she said, her eyes steady on his. You involved security before you checked your own system. And Gregory's posture shifted again, subtle but visible, like the weight of those facts had nowhere left to go but onto him. And the security guard took a small step back, not instructed, not announced, just instinctive, and that movement said more than any statement could, because alignment had changed, and everyone felt it. And Aisha let that moment sit, let it breathe, before adding one more line, precise and final. This is not about a mistake, she said. This is about a pattern. And the room went still again, not because nothing was happening, but because everything had already started to. The word pattern did not fade. It settled, heavy and undeniable, like something the room could not unhear. And for a moment Gregory said nothing. But the silence this time did not protect him, it exposed him, because now every second without a response gave the truth more space to breathe, more room to grow, and the people watching were no longer unsure. They were observing, analyzing, forming conclusions that no explanation could easily undo. And Gregory finally stepped back slightly, not enough to surrender, just enough to reset his stance, his voice lowering again into something controlled but strained. We are not here to discuss assumptions, he said, choosing his words carefully now. We are here to maintain standards. And the phrase sounded rehearsed, like something he had said many times before, but this time it did not land as authority, it landed as deflection, and Aisha caught it instantly, not reacting outwardly, but the smallest shift in her expression suggested recognition, like she had heard that line in a different place, a different time, from a different face. And for a brief second her gaze drifted past Gregory, not looking at anything in particular, but somewhere deeper, somewhere older, and the lobby seemed to blur around her as memories surfaced without permission, a younger version of herself standing in another hotel lobby years ago, dressed carefully, speaking clearly, still being told she did not fit the image, still being asked to wait, while others walked past her without question, still learning that sometimes the decision was made before the conversation even began, and then just as quickly, the memory passed, not lingering, not softening her, but sharpening something inside her, refining it into something steady, something controlled, something powerful, and when her focus returned to the present, it was different, quieter but heavier, like the room itself had shifted to match it, and Gregory noticed it, even if he did not understand it, because his next words came faster, less measured. If you have documentation, now would be the time to present it, he said, pushing the responsibility back onto her, trying to reclaim the structure of control, but Aisha did not reach for anything, did not move to satisfy his demand. Instead she took one slow step forward, closing the space just enough to change the dynamic again, and the movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it pulled every eye in the room with it. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was no softness left in it. You are still asking the wrong question, she said, and Gregory frowned slightly, caught off guard not by volume, but by direction, and she continued, each word placed carefully. "The question is not who I am," she said, her gaze steady. "The question is why you decided I did not belong before you knew anything at all." And this time there was no immediate response. Not from Gregory, not from the staff, not from the guests. Because the weight of that question did not allow for quick answers. It demanded something deeper, something uncomfortable. And behind the desk the young employee lowered his eyes for a moment, as if realizing that what had unfolded was not an isolated moment, but part of something repeated, something systemic. And the security guard shifted again, his stance now fully neutral, no longer aligned with Gregory, no longer certain of his role in the situation, and the room held that tension, thick and quiet, until Aisha added one final line, softer but cutting through everything. "And that answer has nothing to do with me." The question did not demand an answer. It demanded a reckoning. And for a moment Gregory stood there as if the air itself had thickened around him, his usual confidence replaced by something less stable, something reactive. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a sharper edge, no longer smooth, no longer controlled. "You are turning this into something it is not," he said, his tone rising just enough to signal strain. "We treat every guest the same." And the statement landed flat, because the room had already seen otherwise, had already felt the imbalance in real time. And from the side a quiet voice answered before Aisha could, "That is not what we just watched." And it was not loud, not confrontational, just clear, and clarity was harder to argue with than accusation. And Gregory turned toward the voice briefly, frustration flickering across his face, but he did not engage, because the room was no longer a single interaction. It was a collective presence, and that changed everything. And Aisha remained exactly where she was, centered, steady, her posture unchanged, but the space around her had shifted. It now felt like she was the axis and everything else was adjusting around her. And she let the silence stretch again, not as hesitation, but as control, giving Gregory one more chance to step back, one more chance to correct the path he had chosen. But he did not take it. Instead he doubled down, stepping forward again, his voice firmer, louder. "If you cannot verify your identity, then you cannot remain on this property," he said. And this time the words were not just policy. They were pressure, an attempt to force movement, to force compliance, to reclaim dominance through escalation. And that was the moment the room shifted again, sharper this time, because now it was undeniable. Now it was visible. Now it had crossed from tension into action. And the young employee behind the desk spoke again, more firmly now. "Sir, the system already verified her," he said. And Gregory's head turned sharply, irritation breaking through fully. "That is not your decision to make," he snapped. But the employee did not look away this time. And that small act of standing his ground carried more weight than any raised voice. And nearby a guest stepped closer, lowering her phone slightly, but not stopping the recording. "Why are you still pushing this?" she asked. And again it was not loud, not aggressive, just direct. And that was what made it harder to deflect. And Aisha watched all of it, every shift, every alignment, every fracture in the structure that had tried to push her out. And she took one slow breath, as if marking the exact moment the situation crossed into something irreversible. And then she moved, not away, not retreating, but forward, one measured step that brought her fully into Gregory's space without aggression, without force, just presence. And when she spoke, her voice was lower now, controlled but unmistakably firm. "You are not enforcing policy," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You are enforcing a decision you already made." And Gregory opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out, because the truth of it had already settled in the room, had already been witnessed, and the power he thought he held was no longer his alone. It had shifted, divided, redistributed among every person standing there, watching, listening, understanding. And for the first time since this began, Gregory looked not just challenged, but uncertain, and that uncertainty spread, quiet but undeniable, like the beginning of something he could not stop. The uncertainty did not explode. It deepened, settling into the room like a quiet pressure that made every movement feel heavier, every word more deliberate. And for the first time Gregory did not step forward. He hesitated, just a fraction, but enough for everyone to notice, enough for the balance to continue shifting away from him. And Aisha saw it. recognized it instantly, because she had seen that moment before. Not here, not in this exact lobby, but in others, years ago, when the tone changed, when certainty cracked, when control started slipping through fingers that thought they held it tightly. And for a brief second her gaze softened, not in weakness, but in memory, a flash of another space, another desk, another voice telling her she needed to wait, that there was a process, that someone would verify, while others walked past her without question, and she remembered standing there, younger, composed but unheard, feeling the quiet weight of being measured by something she could not see but could always feel. And then the memory shifted, forward, years later, rooms where she was no longer questioned, where her presence was expected, where decisions followed her instead of stopping her, and the contrast between those moments did not create anger, it created clarity, and that clarity settled over her now like armor, invisible but absolute. And when her focus returned fully to Gregory, it carried that entire history with it, not spoken, not explained, but present. And Gregory felt it even if he could not name it, because his next words came slower, less certain. If there has been a misjudgment, we can correct it, he said, and the shift in language was subtle but undeniable, from authority to adjustment, from command to negotiation, and the room caught it immediately, a quiet ripple of recognition moving through the space, because now it was clear, something had changed. And Aisha did not interrupt him, did not rush to accept or reject. She simply let him continue, let him reveal how far he was willing to step back, but he did not go far enough, because he added, "But we still need proper verification." And there it was again, the attempt to hold on to control, to redefine the situation on his terms, and Aisha tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in final assessment, as if confirming what she already knew, and then she spoke, her voice calm but carrying a new weight. Something unmistakable. "You had verification," she said, her eyes steady. "You chose to ignore it." And Gregory's jaw tightened again, caught between retreat and resistance. And behind him the young employee stepped back from the desk slightly, no longer unsure, no longer caught in between, because the truth had already settled, and nearby the security guard shifted fully out of Gregory's line, not leaving, but no longer reinforcing. And that silent movement spoke louder than anything else, because it marked the exact moment authority detached itself from him, and attached somewhere else, somewhere steadier, somewhere earned. And Aisha let the room absorb it, let every person standing there feel that shift, before she added one final line. Quieter now, but sharper than anything before it. "You are not correcting a mistake," she said. "You are reacting to being seen." The words did not raise the volume in the room. They lowered it, like everything unnecessary had just been stripped away, and Gregory stood there with nothing left to hide behind but himself. And that was the part he had been avoiding from the beginning, because now it was not about systems or procedures or verification, it was about him, and everyone in that lobby could see it, could feel it, could trace every step that led to this exact moment. And Aisha did not move, did not press further. She did not need to, because the shift had already completed itself. The room was no longer waiting for her to prove anything. It was waiting for him to respond, and that was a position he had not prepared for. And when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the edge it once carried, replaced now by something more careful, more measured. "There is no need to escalate this further," he said, choosing each word like it might stabilize what had already fallen apart. But the statement landed too late. Because escalation had already happened, not through volume, but through exposure. And Aisha's gaze did not leave him as she reached into her phone again, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the same precision she had carried from the start. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but every syllable carried weight. "Proceed," she said, and on the other end a voice responded immediately, crisp and professional. "Phase 2 is active. Audit protocols are now live." And the words were not meant for the room, but the room heard them anyway, because silence amplifies everything. And Gregory's expression shifted again, confusion now mixing with something closer to concern, because this was no longer a conversation he could redirect. It was a process already in motion, and Aisha lowered the phone slowly, her posture unchanged, her presence now anchored in a way that made the entire space feel structured around her. And she spoke again, not to Gregory alone, but to the room itself, her voice. Steady, clear, everything that has been said here is now documented, she said, and the impact of that statement moved differently. Not emotional, not reactive, but factual, irreversible. And behind the desk the young employee straightened fully now, no longer hesitant, because the situation had crossed into something official, something that did not rely on opinion, and the security guard stepped further back, creating distance that had not existed before, and the guests, still watching, no longer whispered. They simply observed, because the outcome was beginning to take shape, and Gregory let out a slow breath, his composure tightening again, but not in control, in containment. "You are overstepping," he said, but the words no longer carried authority. They sounded like resistance to something already decided, and Aisha tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but final. "No," she replied. "I am responding." And that distinction landed clean, because it reframed everything. And she continued, her tone even, but now unmistakably decisive. "You made your decision the moment I walked in," she said. "Now I am making mine." And the room held that line, felt the shift inside it, because this was no longer about proving identity. It was about consequence, and Gregory stood there, no longer directing the moment, no longer controlling the narrative, but standing inside it, exposed by it. And for the first time since this began, the outcome was not uncertain. It was approaching, steady, and unavoidable. The word consequence did not echo. It settled, like a final piece falling into place, and the room responded without speaking, a collective stillness that felt less like tension and more like recognition, because now everyone understood what this moment had become, and Gregory stood at the center of it, no longer directing anything, no longer shaping the outcome, but standing inside something that was already moving forward without him. And Aisha remained steady, her posture unchanged, her presence now unmistakably grounded, as if the entire structure of the room had aligned itself around her. And for a brief second no one spoke, not the staff, not the guests, not even Gregory, because the silence itself had weight. It carried everything that had been said, everything that had been seen, and everything that could no longer be undone. And then Aisha took one slow breath, controlled and measured, and when she spoke, her voice was not raised, but it carried further than anything. Before it, "You said I did not belong here," she began, her eyes fixed on Gregory. "You said that without checking, without asking, without knowing." And each phrase landed with precision, not emotional, not reactive, but exact, and Gregory shifted slightly, his composure tightening again. But this time it was not control, it was containment, like he was trying to hold something together that had already broken apart. And Aisha continued, her tone steady. "You involved security, you dismissed your own system, and you ignored your own staff," she said. And behind him the young employee lowered his gaze for a moment, not in shame, but in recognition, because the truth of it had become undeniable. And Aisha took one small step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the space between them completely. And in that space her presence felt heavier, more defined, like the final line before something irreversible. And then she said it, clear, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. "My name is Aisha Carter," she said, "and I do not need access to this hotel." A brief pause, just enough for the room to absorb the words, "I built it." And the silence that followed was immediate, complete, and absolute, like the entire room had been pulled into that single statement. And Gregory did not respond, because there was nothing left to say. The narrative he had been holding on to collapsed in that instant, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And around them the shift was visible now, not just felt. Guests straightened, some exchanged glances, others lowered their phones slightly, not because they were done recording, but because the moment had moved beyond shock into understanding, and the security guard stepped fully back, creating a clear space that no longer belonged to Gregory at all. And Aisha held his gaze for 1 second longer, before turning slightly, not away from him, but toward the room, toward the witnesses, toward the truth that had unfolded in front of them. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not just control, but authority. This was never about access, she said. It was about assumption. And the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not just describe the moment, they defined it. And Gregory stood there, silent, as the weight of that definition settled over. Everything he had done, everything he had said, and everything he could no longer undo. The silence did not break with noise, it broke with understanding, slow and spreading, like something settling into place across every face in the room. And Gregory stood there, frozen not by shock, but by realization. Because there was no version of this moment where he could recover what had just been lost, and it showed, not in what he said, but in what he could not say, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, his posture no longer firm but suspended, caught between reaction and retreat. And Aisha did not rush him, did not press the moment further. She simply let it unfold, let the weight of her words do what they were meant to do, because this was never about overpowering him. It was about exposing the truth he had already revealed. And around them the room shifted again, but this time it was not tension, it was alignment. Guests who had been watching now stood straighter, their expressions no longer uncertain, some nodding slightly, others exchanging quiet looks that said the same thing without words. And the young employee behind the desk stepped forward just enough to be seen, no longer hiding behind the system, his voice steady now. The system confirms full ownership access, he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that no one could pretend not to hear it. And that was the moment the structure Gregory had been holding onto collapsed completely, not with drama, not with sound, but with absence, because the authority he had tried to project no longer had anything supporting it. And the security guard, who had once stood beside him, now stood apart, his stance neutral, his presence no longer reinforcing but observing. And that shift was visible to everyone, unmistakable. And Aisha turned slightly toward the desk, her gaze moving briefly to the employee, acknowledging not just what he said, but that he chose to say it. And then she turned back, her focus returning to Gregory with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning. But now there was something else layered into it, something final, something that did not ask for recognition because it already had it. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and measured. "This room watched you decide who I was before you verified anything," she said, and no one interrupted, no one moved, because every word matched what they had seen, what they had felt, what they had understood. And she continued, not louder, but sharper. "They watched you double down when the system told you otherwise." And Gregory's eyes flickered, not defiant anymore, but unsettled, because now the narrative was no longer his to shape. It belonged to the room, and the room had already made its judgment. And Aisha took one slow breath before finishing, her tone unchanged but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "And now they are watching what happens next." And that line did not threaten, it did not accuse, it simply defined. And in doing so it removed any illusion that this could be contained, minimized, or undone. And Gregory stood there with nothing left to assert, nothing left to redirect. Only the reality of the moment in front of him, and the understanding that whatever came next would not be decided by him. The room did not need to be told what came next. It could feel it building, steady and irreversible, like a shift in gravity that no one could deny anymore. And Aisha stood at the center of it, not raised above anyone, not louder than anyone, but undeniably in control of what followed. And Gregory remained where he was, his posture no longer commanding, no longer certain, but held in place by the weight of everything that had just unfolded. And for a moment no one spoke, because the outcome was no longer a question. It was a sequence waiting to complete itself. And then Aisha lifted her phone again, not with urgency, not with drama, but with the same calm precision that had carried her through every second of this moment. And when she spoke, her voice was clear, controlled, and final. "Proceed to termination review," she said, and the response came. Instantly, firm and unmistakable. Authorization confirmed, executive override in effect. And the words moved through the room like a current, quiet but powerful, because they did not just signal action, they confirmed authority, real authority, the kind that did not need to be argued or proven. And Gregory's eyes shifted slightly, the first visible sign that he understood what those words meant. not as a possibility, but as reality. And Aisha lowered the phone slowly, her gaze returning to him, steady, composed, and unshaken. "You made a decision without facts," she said, her tone even. "Now I am making one with them." And there was no anger in her voice, no raised tone, only clarity, and that made it land harder, because it was not reactive, it was deliberate. And behind the desk the system screen changed, subtle but visible, access logs updating, credentials shifting, and the young employee stepped back slightly, watching it happen in real time, his expression no longer uncertain but aware, because this was no longer a moment. It was a consequence unfolding, and Gregory's composure tightened again, but it was different now. Not authority, not control, but resistance to something he could not stop. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice lower, more contained, but the words lacked the force they once carried, because necessity was no longer his to define. And Aisha held his gaze for a moment longer before responding, her voice calm, precise, and final. "No," she said, "this is accountability." And that word settled deeper than anything before it, because it did not argue. It concluded, and around them the room remained still, not tense, not uncertain, but witnessing, fully present in what was happening. Because this was no longer about a single interaction, it was about a standard being set in real time, and Aisha let that moment breathe, let it fully land. Across every person watching, before adding one final line, quiet but undeniable, "You did not just misjudge me," she said. "You revealed how you judge everyone." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, because nothing more needed to be said. The decision had already been made, and everyone in that room knew it. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt resolved, like a chapter closing in real time. And for a moment no one moved, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that what had just happened would not be undone. And Aisha stood there, not elevated, not removed, but grounded in a way that made everything around her feel clearer, more defined. And Gregory remained still, his presence no longer carrying authority, only the weight of a moment that had revealed more than he intended. And behind the desk the system completed its process quietly, access levels shifting, credentials updating, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that did not need to announce itself. And the young employee stepped back fully now, no longer caught between instruction and truth. His posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, because the tension that once held him there had dissolved into something simpler, something honest. And the security guard stood at a distance, neutral, no longer part of the situation but a witness to its outcome. And around them the guests remained present, not rushing away, not returning to their conversations, because they understood they had just seen something that extended beyond a single interaction, something that spoke to how quickly assumptions could form and how quietly they could be corrected when confronted with truth. And Aisha let the room settle, let the moment fully land before she moved again, not turning away abruptly, not dismissing what had happened, but acknowledging it in the way she carried herself, composed, deliberate, and complete. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and clear, not raised, not sharpened, just certain. "Respect is not something you offer based on appearance," she said, her eyes moving briefly across the room, not searching for agreement, but recognizing those who had witnessed. "It is something you maintain as a standard." And the words did not demand applause. They did not seek reaction. They simply existed as truth, and that truth settled into the space in a way that felt lasting, not tied to this moment alone, but extending beyond it. And Gregory lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in understanding, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to correct, only the reality of what had been revealed. And Aisha turned then, not away from responsibility, but toward resolution, her steps measured, unhurried, moving through the lobby with the same quiet presence she had entered with. But now the room responded differently, not with doubt, not with hesitation, but with awareness. And as she passed, no one spoke, no one needed to, because the message had already been delivered, not through volume, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And as the doors opened and closed behind her, the space she left did not return to what it had been before. It remained changed, marked by a moment that did not require noise to be powerful, only truth to be undeniable.